Okay. All right. Yeah, Jesse, where are you at with your training cycle?
So right now I'm kind of starting to think more about the race season. Thus far here, I've been kind of setting myself up. I've been setting kind of a big base of training volume, and I'm going to start adding in a little bit more intensity in my training, moving into more of the build phase. So my volume will probably drop down a little bit, and my intensity will increase um, across the board, especially in my biking and running.
Gotcha.
And
Okay. So you're transitioning from the base to the build phase is how the terminology goes. So how long has your base phase been?
Um, it started kind of end of December, beginning of January in there.
Okay. So
Um,
it's about 2 months or so.
yeah, and it's, I guess, in my own training, since I've been doing this a while, um, it's a little bit different than I'd say what I'm doing with the athletes that I coach.
That's a little bit of a. How long was your bike ride?
So I guess on Sunday I rode 207 miles.
207 miles
Um,
of crazy. Yeah, that's terrible.
And I would never assign a 207-mile ride to an athlete unless they really were at a place where they could handle that. Um, Leading up to that, I did like a 175-mile ride and a 160-mile ride, a 145-mile ride.
I don't like driving more than 100 miles. I mean,
Yeah.
this is terrible.
So that's at the end of your base phase. You're really rolling. Uh,
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Um,
Are your run volumes, proportionally as high, run and swim?
um, not, not really. I'd say I didn't transition all at once with my training. I kind of did some bigger, longer runs in January where I was doing trail runs that I think I had a trail run that got like up to like 4 hours.
Yeah.
And then I kind of transitioned to more road running in the last month and I've gotten a lot shorter in duration, closer to 2 hours. And I've already started kind of upping the intensity in my run a little bit so that, I'm running like 18 miles in those 2 hours. And then I've kind of stayed there for a while before I kind of increase that volume up again with the intensity. So my training is a little bit more like staggered, uh, and that's just a function of where I'm at in my training cycle throughout the decade I've been doing this. Because every year isn't the same. It builds on the years before, and things always changing a little bit. So I guess
It hits on your weaknesses from years before.
right. Yes. I mean, in general, I'm a weak cyclist, so that's why I'm riding, 175, 200 miles. I'm kind of focusing on that.
Gotcha. Okay. Okay. So if somebody's never really done, they've been active, maybe they've done a couple triathlons for fun, and they're trying to now be a little more competitive, a little more deliberate in their training. Maybe it's too late in the game now, I'm not sure, but how might they structure their first, base phase, and then, that transition? What things should they look out for, and how do they do that transition?
First off, it's never too late, so they're in good shape.
You can always base.
Is that like a sales pitch?
Yeah, totally.
You can always build the base.
Training. If you want to contact Jesse.
Do not do a 200-mile ride. That's what I'd say first of all.
Step one, don't do what Jesse does.
Don't do what I do. No, but I would say you really want to make sure you have a good base phase. You want to spend some time where you're just putting volume in all three disciplines, because that's really building your durability. That's, if you've gone for enough runs, you're building up durability in your entire body, and maybe you guys can talk about, I'm using a little more bro science here for why that works. But once you've run enough mileage, then when you start adding in intensity, your body can handle it. So taking 2 months or even longer, especially if you're very new, taking 6 months and just focusing on volume in all three disciplines is what sets the stage to stay injury-free and really building that aerobic base that you need in order to add in intensity. Okay. Because if you don't have an aerobic base, then the intensity isn't going to get you anywhere.
Okay.
So base phase super important.
I like how you say that, though. I think that most often when people come in and they're first starting off with triathlon, or really any of these endurance sports, the cardiovascular system just develops so much faster. So your ability cardiovascular to handle like a 10-mile run when you first start, you develop that so much faster than your body's actual tolerance for it. You know, the connective tissue changes, the muscle changes. So I really like that. And, you know, when he talks about building a base over a decade, I mean, the amount of tissue changes that have actually occurred that allow him to survive that training without driving an injury is huge. Because, I mean, Brian, you and me, we talk about like a 10% increase typically. Like, if somebody has a 10% increase, that's one of the things we'll look for as a training error that didn't drive somebody having an injury.
Yeah, and that concept of training years and training age is something I've been thinking about a lot more recently. Of I think it's how much volume can you handle, and also how fast can you get to a certain level. Like, I have a history more as a weightlifter. I can get up to a certain level in a squat pretty quick that it might take somebody like Jesse, who's been an endurance guy, longer. But it would take me way more to build up volume, like a 220 bike ride, because I don't have a decade of doing that.
Yeah, the first time I lifted more than Jesse's ever been able to do.
Thank you for showing that.
And so I don't know what that's about.
But another cool concept.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, just on that 10% rule, Craig, that you were mentioning, I don't know if you guys have seen anything by a guy named Tim Gabbett, but it's this acute to chronic workload ratio. And so he's done it over a series of 4 weeks, but I think you could even spread that longer into months potentially of what's your volume over the past 4 weeks and what's your volume this week. And if you take the average of the past 4 divided by this 4, it shouldn't be above a certain amount. So you can create a ratio for what your workload has been. And then as you add intensity, you can put a RPE, like a how hard was it, a kind of arbitrary number to it, and then have these, a pretty good running total of how hard you're working, how much you're working. And he's had some pretty good results of doing that, more with rugby guys and soccer players, I think, not triathletes, but guys who are running a lot. And so that's just another way to get a little more advanced, I think, with how you're tracking your volume through that base phase.
Well, I think that Jesse, before we started talking, Jesse was talking about what's the metric you guys use?
Yeah, so there's like a program that a lot of coaches and athletes use called Training Peaks. And there are other programs out there that do very, very similar things. But they basically track your training stress. So you wear a heart rate monitor, you use a power meter, and you have kind of like your zone set so that it knows, like, if I'm riding at like 118 beats, then it's an aerobic ride, and I'm accumulating so much training stress. Whereas if I'm riding at 160 beats, my training stress is a lot higher. Yeah. So it calculates like a training stress score for all your workouts. It totals them for the week, and then it kind of creates like a training stress balance of where you're at in like fatigue versus freshness week by week, and you can kind of that's a great thing you can use to keep track of for like the 10% rule.
Yeah, without getting too crazy with the metrics, I feel like you could easily set up a spreadsheet to track 10% or even to track that running average. I like that. I like that a lot, because I imagine that's the only way you're able to survive, especially at your level now with a lot of volume. That base phase is if a fair number of those miles are at a lower intensity, right? And you might sneak up higher than you might realize if you're not wearing a monitor.
And that's like something that I really have to preach to a lot of my athletes, because it's almost unnatural, especially if athletes don't do a ton of volume, and so they're used to kind of doing a ton of like what I call zone 3 or like blue zone training. Yeah. Where, like, it feels good because you're going kind of hard. Yeah. And you feel like you're accomplishing something. Yeah. Or really you're just making yourself tired, and you're achieving like the same physiological gains as if you were running like considerably easier. Yeah. And so you basically you can't survive base phase because all your training is just a little bit too hard. Yeah. So that's definitely like.
I actually heard you talk about it before, and it's one of the things where you've talked about people not realizing the difference, like where you'll have a recovery run and people are doing a recovery run with you that are considerably slower, and they'll actually run it faster. Right. Which is it's one of those things where I think it's a misunderstanding of how you train.
Yeah, and that's, for a while I didn't wear a heart rate monitor and didn't really think much about them, but for that reason, I've been realizing that sometimes, especially my ultra marathon runners or long triathletes, some of them are working too hard, too much when they think they're going easy, and then they end up with overtraining syndrome and the wheels fall off. Okay.
I think a good rule of thumb with that, Brian, too, with the overtraining issue, if you start to lose motivation, I think that's probably the number one sign that I feel like I have, especially during these phase changes like Jesse's talking about, is where I feel like I have, like the end of these training sessions, these training phases where people get this cumulative fatigue, where their motivation just drops off. That's the first sign. And if you're not measuring like your heart rate first thing in the morning or using some level of like a heart rate monitor that can look at your R to R interval, you may be coming close to the edge and not even realize it. It's very easy to overstep, especially if you're one of those people that likes the high volume.
Is there a good app that you guys can recommend to people watching? Is there one for that TSS score? Or Craig, I know you're talking about heart rate variability. Is there any tools that you tell people to use?
Your coach should do it. Your coach should be helping you monitor that. I mean, that's the purpose of having a coach like Jesse, where they're actually checking your data. That's not. I think that's a skilled thing to monitor. I mean, you have a team around you if you're really pushing it, but somebody like Jesse, who's actually a coach, can catch stuff like that by looking at your data and putting it in. I mean, that's their responsibility. But if you're by yourself, I don't know.
So yeah, I would say that like if you don't have a coach, then you need to be extremely careful, because that's when you're going to get yourself into trouble.
Yeah.
Because you're probably fairly type A, and you're probably like going to want to train more and harder all the time. And taking those preemptive rest days or those preemptive easy days is just so crucial, because once you go over that edge, it's just too hard to get back. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the new watches actually have heart rate variability tests you can do on them.
Gotcha.
You have to like load an extra app on, but like I've got a Garmin and I know it does it. So you can just throw in your heart rate monitor in the morning and do a quick check on there. I think it takes like 30 seconds where you just kind of breathe deeply.
Yeah.
And it gives you a score, and then you kind of keep track of that over time.
Yeah.
I actually used the Omega Wave, Brian, and it didn't work.
It didn't.
So I've had several athletes do that, but
Omega Wave,
honestly, even with these more expensive watches, the things that seem to be that I've had the most success with are the heart rate first thing in the morning, and then motivation level.
Yeah.
You talk about that, like if the workout seems really, really hard, or you can't give it that extra little level, it's like you just can't do it. That's not normal, and that's something you shouldn't ignore. And that's when, or you start to get these cumulative overuse injuries that just hammer you, right?
What I tend to look for in my athletes is kind of a decoupling of heart rate versus rate of perceived exertion.
Okay, I really like that metric. You shouldn't be working hard if your heart rate's low. Yeah.
And it's very, like, their heart rate's super low, and they're putting comments in, and they're like, man, that was like the hardest run I've done all week, or something like that. Where it's like, whoa, this RP does not at all match where your heart rate was. We need to take a step back here.
Yeah.
And the other thing that people don't factor in is their life stress. And then we start, like, if I look at just their training, it's like, oh, your training is like kind of normal for you.
Yeah.
And then I have a conversation with them, and it's like, well, somebody didn't show up at work, so I needed to work an extra 6-hour shift last night. I didn't get off until 1 a.m. and woke up at 5 and did this workout, and so.
Or you have 4 cats.
Or I don't know why you would ever do that. But
yeah, I don't know who would ever have 4 cats.
My
That's
gosh.
ridiculous.
But yeah, these other life factors that people just look at their training log and they don't think about, that, I mean, is like life stress, training stress. Your body interprets stress as stress.
Yeah.
So they all add up.
And what about, I know that we recommend to pretty much every endurance athlete we work with to get them on a strength training plan. Are you periodizing your strength training plan? I have some thoughts on that, but how do you manage your strength training volume to make sure that doesn't push you into overtraining? Because you want to be supportive. You don't want to necessarily train to be a power athlete, power lifter.
That's That's a good question. And so I guess I work with Brian here, and we kind of talk about where I'm at and how things are going. But a lot of that is kind of self-regulated, where I kind of know where I'm at in my training, and I know where my races are, and so it's like, it's just got to be a little bit on how I feel. Like some days I show up to the gym and I'm like, well, I rode 75 miles today and ran 6 miles, and I know that if I do my lifting to the absolute max like I'm supposed to, or whatever that day is, like I'm supposed to go up 10 pounds today, sometimes like, well, I just need to not do that. And, it's just a conversation ongoing with kind of my strength coach. And
Yeah.
The other critical thing is that you cut volume, not intensity.
Right.
I believe that's probably the number one thing. The biggest mistake I see with people's training plans is they'll still hit the same volume, like they'll do sets and reps when they're fatigued, but instead of cutting some of the sets and keeping the weight up, so you still get the strength benefits. And if you don't do that, that's where you see the massive losses during season that you can really prevent.
Yeah.
Really prevent.
And then my other thought too is in the base phase, you want to watch out for overtraining. But if you're feeling like you're recovering, that's the time to really go for it. Build up your strength. Because if you need to cut weight or whatever, you hopefully have time. Before racing. Even though I really think it's tough to put weight on if you're an endurance athlete. And then as you move into the build phase where you build an intensity on the bike and the run and the pool, that's when you cut your volume a little bit in the gym potentially, but add some power training, a little more explosive stuff that doesn't need to be high volume to be effective, and you can typically recover pretty well from.
Yeah, I'd say if my lifting makes me tired in the phase, that's fine. It doesn't matter. And so I get up to kind of like basically as much weight as I can handle then, and then I try and stay there the rest of the year.
Yeah. Like I remember when we were working together, it was a year or two ago, but you would come in either right after a long but easy day, and we would have you lift, and you would feel pretty crushed, but then you'd be able to recover from it. And that was kind of, you just knew that was part of your base phase at that point in time.
Right. Yeah, I definitely will run a mile, and then I'll make sure that I cut my volume that day. Make sure I don't get overly fatigued.
Yeah.
It's been difficult to learn that because I've had to suffer from overtraining multiple times.
Yeah. Okay, maybe in just the last few minutes before we all have to jump, any other thoughts of this transition from base to build phase? Like, I think that's a point where people can get injured. And so some things that I recommend that my people do is stay on a good warm-up activation routine. Is there anything else that you guys really recommend, or anything that you see people doing that doesn't tend to work and you think time would be better spent elsewhere?
First?
Sure. So I just say that I think you're right. I think that people will get a little bit more tired in this. They're adding an intensity. It's getting harder.
Yeah.
So people start cutting corners. It's like, oh, I'm going to sleep an extra 10 minutes and I'm going to skip my warm-up or whatever I was. And I say that's like exactly the wrong thing to do. I'd rather have you cut your workout a little bit and really do just what you said. Make sure you're doing those things that have been keeping you healthy, doing whatever prehab you're doing to make sure you're 100% ready for the workouts. And then if you need volume, cut volume so that you can get enough sleep and actually recover. But don't skip out on all the little things that you've been doing before.
And this is where we see the overuse injuries, the ones that are like the sore knee, like patellar tendinopathy, the Achilles tendinopathy, because people are increasing their swimming, and then they're running, the interaction between those two things. Topic for another discussion, but this is where we start to see the more the overuse issues that are typically actually very, very easy to stop. I mean, they're not hard to manage, but this is when I think most people ignore them, because they're the ones that you start to run and initially it's painful, right? Like it kind of hurts, and then it goes away. And so they're showing that they're in like a stage 1 or stage 2. It's not affecting them and not really affecting performance, but it's in the build phase where I think that they take to the level that, wow, now I can't run. And if I could say one thing, it'd be like during this transition, if your legs feel terrible or you're starting to have these type of injuries, it's the easiest time to actually address them because you just made it through the hard part. Now we can correct it. So
Yeah.
I think this is the perfect time period where you can actually address those problems.
Yeah, and I find that people are really excited to maybe do some speed work or get out of that high volume phase, and but then that's when they start blowing past warning signs potentially, and then it's race day, and they're beat up, but they've invested the whole season, and then they come out of the race, and you got to spend a few months putting them back together again, and so yeah, it's getting on stuff early.
But it's good for the bottom line.
Right. Yeah. Have them keep going.
But I think that could be a cool topic for another discussion.
Yeah, I think there's a couple places we go in our discussion. I think, not getting into today, but is that piece. I know there's a whole camp in endurance sports led by, I don't know if you guys heard of Brian McKenzie, who kind of don't preach a lot of high volume. I think that would be an interesting discussion to go to at some point. So we can jump off from there. But yeah, hopefully this was helpful with people thinking about that base phase, recovering, overtraining, and how to transition out of that.
Awesome.
Sweet.
Thanks, Brian.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.